in the Middle East, but Elisa has me beat by well over a decade. Elisa worked with me on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee as the senior professional staff, advising three different Democratic chairmen and ranking members of the committee on issues relating to the Middle East and North Africa, nonproliferation, and international financial institutions. Her career in the executive branch spans across Democratic and Republican administrations, with service in the State Department, the Department of Defense, and the National Security Council, and with assignments from Embassy Baghdad to our mission at the United Nations. Her analysis has appeared in such outlets as the Washington Post, Newsweek, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, War on the Rocks, good blog, by the way, BBC, CNN, and XM Radio. She was an adjunct faculty member in the graduate programs at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. She's currently an adjunct senior fellow at RAND Corporation and a principal with Scolari Advisors. She is also a member of the executive board of directors of the Navy Marine Corps Relief Society, which is a cause near and dear to her heart, and that of her husband, retired Marine Corps Major General John Ewers. Thank you, Elisa, for joining us. Really appreciate it and looking forward to a great talk.
I'm so pleased to be here, and thank you, Allison, for extending the invitation. And it's so just wonderful to be back on screen with Chris.
So, Elisa, I'd like to start off maybe where the previous webinar kind of left off, and that is that we have now seen some differing assessments on the extent of the damage that Israeli and American strikes inflicted on Iran's nuclear program. We've seen President Trump say it was obliterated. We saw the DIA assessment that said decidedly not obliterated. The Israelis have thrown their 2 cents in. So are we starting to see a consensus as to how big of a setback this was to Iran's nuclear program and what has been destroyed or at least buried in these strikes?
So I think there are a couple of things to keep in mind here as we kind of await the sifting through of the information on a battle assessment. First of all, I think it requires us to keep in mind that this was really a remarkable operation, both with respect to the U.S. strike and the Israeli strikes over the course of 12 days, and arguably the strikes from last year as well, which kind of set up the stage for this to take place so successfully. But this tactical win, which came out of decades of planning, it still needs to be translated into something more, and the battle assessment is part of that. But it's a reminder that the program was never really going to be eliminated by military means alone. So there's unlikely to ever be a complete assessment. There are a host of streams of information that are going to help fill out this picture, but it's not perfect. And part of that is because we're unlikely to get direct eyes on the facilities themselves, right? Especially now that the inspectors from the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, have been thrown out of Iran. EU experts, intelligence officers, they're going to look at the information they have from lots of streams to get a realistic picture. But there's likely to be a gap between what we can know for certain and what is really the complete damage assessment. I think the second thing to keep in mind is that the nuclear program in Iran was designed to be redundant. It was designed to be dispersed, to essentially evade not only detection to some degree, but exactly this kind of attack. And that was learned from experience based on the attack on Iraq's nuclear reactor in the 80s. So the facilities at the locations at Natanz, Esfahan, and Fordow are unlikely to make up the whole of Iran's nuclear infrastructure. So what we know at this point is that the facilities have definitely incurred damage, and they've incurred damage that renders them essentially offline for the time being. They can't be used to manufacture the centrifuges that are necessary to enrich uranium. They are not able to conduct the degree of research related to advanced centrifuges, for example, or related to any elements of potential weaponization use. So all this at a minimum means that the capacity for Iran to use its infrastructure to develop what's necessary for a nuclear weapon is set back by some time. The estimates that I'm hearing kind of everyone coalesce around is probably about 2 years of a setback, right? Which is significant, but it's not a decade. It's not 15, 20 years. It is still a relatively short period of time. But I think the more important piece of this equation is that there are very clear indications that some of the stockpile of Iran's uranium that was at these facilities, especially uranium that was enriched to a higher level of 60%, it was either moved beforehand or may have survived the strikes or some combination of that. And so there's also indications that some capacity to manufacture centrifuges remains. So, as you know better than anyone, you can't really bomb the knowledge that goes into manufacturing centrifuges or the building of an enrichment facility. And so these elements of the program, if they survive and survive intact elsewhere, you really go to the point of what can be reconstituted if and when Iran chooses to do that. We didn't talk about yet the missile capabilities. We can talk about that. But when we look at the broad battle assessment as damage assessment, the damage to those capabilities, the stockpile of missiles, the launchers, the production development capacity, that's pretty significant as well. So I think ultimately we're where we are is a program that is severely damaged, a capacity that has been set back, but very unclear for how long.
So given this assessment, this likely assessment of damage, setback, but not eliminated, do you think does that make Iran more or less inclined to go for a deal with the Trump administration as we've seen him push?
So, I mean, that is the real question, right? Is how is the Iranian regime thinking about its own next steps with respect to the program? If, when, and how it might reconstitute, whether it would do so overtly, whether it would do it covertly, which I think the risk of that has increased significantly. And I think at the end of the day, this regime's first, second, and third preoccupation is its own survival. And so when you look at it through that lens, I think that informs how Iran's thinking about its own motives right now and where it goes from here, because it is not going to want to incur the kind of cost that comes from a second or third potential direct confrontation. We can talk a little bit more about how it responded already and what options it has to continue its retaliation. But it's going to look for a de-escalatory path, if for no other reason, to regroup. I mean, we clearly have to imagine that there is an enormous amount of chaos inside of the regime right now. Its entire military leadership was assassinated. Its scientific leadership and its program experts were targeted and assassinated. And so the system itself is needing to recover from that. And so it probably wants some time and space to do that. And one of the best ways for it to do that and to rebuild some leverage is to de-escalate and return to negotiations. But that's a playbook we've seen before. And I think, as we're going to talk about, lots of things have changed over the last month and arguably over the last 8 months. And so the same playbook may not apply. But I think what we're seeing is an Iran who's preparing to engage even for the tactical space it needs to recover from this attack.
Right. Yeah. I think this discussion of we've kind of seen this before. We've seen something like it before, but not exactly the same playbook, leads me to what I think is my next question is how, assuming they go this path and go back to the negotiating table, what do negotiations or what does a deal with President Trump look like compared to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that we had? Because it seems to me, as you said, if they're trying to buy time, it seems like the main sticking point is probably Iran's ability or inability to enrich uranium at some point along the line. So what is it? How would something like this compare to the JCPOA?
So, I mean, it's a great question, right? And the context is very different too, right? So, Iran's leverage going into this is very different than the leverage it had going into negotiations with the Obama administration in 2012, 13, 14, and then ultimately the conclusion of the deal in 15. So, I think there are two ways to think about this, and you might have more ways to think about it. But I think about it in terms of there are elements to a non-proliferation or a disarmament agreement that are kind of fixed, right? You kind of know what they are. They're basic principles on limits of how much uranium you can have and at what varying degrees of enrichment, limits on those infrastructure you can have in a civilian nuclear program, the number of centrifuges, et cetera, right? The limits on research and development. With Iran, it's complicated by the additional element of its past weaponization and possibly even more recent weaponization activity. But ultimately, like these are kind of the dials that have to be turned up or down in any agreement to put a framework in place to manage for a non-proliferation agreement. And then the monitoring and verification elements that are in place to ensure that the obligations are met. But here, and those were all elements of the JCPOA, right? To varying degrees. What you have here, though, is a weakened Iran with more limited leverage. You have a post-attack on the program environment dynamic, and you have this stated goal by the Trump administration that it wants Iran to forego any enrichment on its own soil. It's very difficult, I think, to imagine how this regime would make that concession, especially at the onset and especially in this weakened position, right? And so I think there's some speculation that about before the attack, some creative ways in which to deal with this enrichment question, like guaranteeing that Iran would have access to the kind of fuel it would need for a civilian nuclear program to run, for example. It, I think it's really hard to imagine how this looks exactly like the JCPOA uh, because so much has changed. But I can tell you for sure two things. One, that the element of sanctions relief and how Iran's concessions uh, are are met with the assurances that are necessary on sanctions relief will be a key element of this. And then I think kind of the practical things like the sunsets or the expirations that were part of the JCPOA are going to be reconsidered entirely. So I guess the last thing I'll say, and then you tell me what I've missed, Chris, but uh, this is probably not going to be one big, beautiful deal, right? It's going to be a set of measures adopted in stages, if for no other reason that there is massive trust and confidence gaps on all sides of the equation. It's going to require verification at every step, some of which is going to be painstakingly technical in nature and even more difficult to do when half of Iran's program is under, the rubble of a destroyed mountain. Um, and that creates both time and space for opportunity, but it also creates time and space for miscalculation, right? And so it's unlikely to be something that can be wrapped up with a pretty bow.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm just wondering, when you mentioned sanctions relief, like what sanctions relief would look like under this administration, whether it's going to be the kind of like organized, step by step phased, or if it's going to be more kind of like what we've seen in Syria, where, President Trump comes out from behind a curtain one day and boom, everything's almost everything's lifted.
Well, I think the Syria example is really instructive, right? And I think I don't know this, but I would imagine that the special envoy, when he sits down with the Iranian delegation, will allude to the fact that President Trump is prepared to do big things like
Mhm.
what we've witnessed in Syria as a way to build some of that assurance that they can deliver on a deal if the Iranian regime is prepared to make the concessions on the program that are necessary. Now, I think the Syria sanctions regime is complicated and kind of a web of sanctions. The Iranian sanctions regime is even more complicated. And so getting that unfurled is going to be its own undertaking. It's also got elements of a multilateral sanctions regime that needs to be considered as well. So I don't think if the Iranian negotiators try and push for a kind of instantaneous lifting of sanctions, I highly doubt that they're going to get satisfaction on that, both for technical reasons and for political reasons that we can talk about.
Right. So I got to tell you, Elisa, this is bringing up flashbacks for me of the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act. I'm sure it's bringing your own. You were in the administration when that went through, so you probably have your own kind of unique set of feelings about that. Um, but if you could, put your senior Hill staff hat back on for a second, um, can you describe like how would an agreement, I'm starting to sense that maybe there's loopholes or shades of gray about, but would an agreement be subject to an aura, and then and if so how would you see that playing out now that Republicans hold the White House and both houses of Congress?
So you may remember that during the Biden administration, especially before October 7th, and there were efforts to engage with Iran on a resumption of negotiations in various ways. There was a lot of debate around this. Republican members were very adamant that anything that the Biden administration did to return to the JCPOA or build off the JCPOA would need to come back to Congress for approval because of the existing law. It'll be interesting to see whether they think that that's required now. I think a clean reading of the law would require it, right? I mean, very simply, any agreement, and the law doesn't specify that it has to be a nuclear agreement with Iran, but any agreement with Iran that includes sanctions relief as part of the framework is required by law to be submitted for review. What is also required by law are some assessments by the executive branch that go along with the submission of the text of any agreement, and then the 60-day review period, during which the executive branch is constrained from executing the agreement if that agreement includes sanctions relief. So, in other words, for 60 days, the executive is bound to not offer any lifting temporarily or otherwise of sanctions while Congress is reviewing the agreement and the associated assessments. Now, that's the only thing the executive has to do, and then it has to wait out the 60 days. Now, then Congress gets to decide whether it's going to take further action. And I think people have conflated these things and this has happened to the press and elsewhere, that congressional approval of the agreement is required by law. That's not the case. What's required by law is that it be submitted for review. Congress can then make a determination on whether it wants to vote to approve or disapprove the agreement. It can also choose to do nothing at all. And so this kind of gets back to your point, Chris, about what happens when uh, both chambers are led by Republicans and the White House is also held by the Republican Party. Under those circumstances, does this Congress call for a vote on an agreement that this administration has negotiated and clearly wants to pursue if they're going forward to submit it to Congress. Is that a vote that they want to take? And if so, how will the kind of politics of that vote play up against the substance of the agreement? Like, is the
Mhm.
agreement sound as a policy matter? Never mind whether it's acceptable on as a political matter. And then how will Democrats deal with such a vote when all but one current member of the Democratic Party in the Senate, for example, voted for the JCPOA in 2015? If I'm doing my math right, I think everyone else who voted against it is no longer a member of the Senate. So, and the changeover in the House means that a good chunk of Democrats in the House were not there in 2015 to vote one way or another. But if they agree with the substance of the deal, how will they manage for the politics? Which I think brings us back to the option that there may not be a congressional vote at all. And if an agreement is reached and it's submitted for review, 60 days could pass with no further action from Congress. I mean, I think that's a credible path
Mhm.
under the current circumstances, especially if it's this year.
So there's the potential for no congressional action, potentially no hearings, taking up the like examining the deal or aspects of the deal.
I wouldn't rule out that possibility. I
Okay.
mean, I think there's going to be a tension here, especially for Republican members who are you want to focus on a deal that is better than the JCPOA, right? They claimed there were lots of problems with the JCPOA that the Obama administration negotiated. They'd want to see something close to zero enrichment, if not zero enrichment. So they're going to have to balance their criticisms of the JCPOA against what the
Mhm.
Trump administration ends up negotiating. And if those two things have similar components, uh, I'd be hard pressed, I think, if I were a senior advisor to the Republicans to say yes, hold hearings on this, because it's going to put Republican members in a pretty difficult position. And there will clearly be some attacks from the Democratic side, but ultimately, we've seen on any number of issues already, domestic as well as national security, that Republican members are not enthusiastic about kind of confronting this administration on its choices right now. And so, under this dynamic, it's hard for me to imagine that this would be the issue that they would choose to pick that first fight with the
Right.
administration. I don't know what you think, but I think it puts them in a bind, and so doing nothing might be the easiest political option.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine a lot of members of Congress or even, Chairman Risch on the Senate Foreign Relations and certainly Chairman Mast and HVAC deciding that this is the hill that they're gonna make their stand on at long last. So now obviously Iran and the US aren't the only ones with a stake here. There's other actors in the region that are watching this very closely. Let's start with the Israelis, since I understand that you just met with some of the members of the Israeli delegation that's currently in DC with Prime Minister Netanyahu. So, do you have a sense of how satisfied the Israelis are likely to be with the current state of Iran's nuclear program, given kind of how you said it's not gone, but it is, it is set back, and then what they're thinking about in terms of a possible nuclear deal?
So I think for the Israeli government in particular, you definitely have to look at it from the perspective of everything that they've accomplished over the course of the last over the last year, right? With respect to you decimating Iran's kind of strategic proxy depth by eliminating the leadership and the capacity of Hezbollah in Lebanon to conduct attacks. And you saw Hezbollah very publicly a decide not to participate in any retaliation against these last attacks on the Iranian nuclear program. And so I think that's a testament to the environment in which Israel now sees itself. You couple with that what has happened in Syria, um, and the fact that operationally speaking, Israel has uh, seriously degraded, if not eliminated, the military capacity of Hamas in Gaza. So, in that context, I think um, there is a degree of satisfaction that Iran doesn't have the ability to retaliate in the same way that it could have under normal circumstances for conventional direct attack on its soil. I think it reflects a satisfaction that the success of this operation at the tactical level, combined with the United States participating and taking the direct actions it has taken, has reestablished kind of the credibility of the military tool here. And so I think especially in the Israeli security establishment, who, as you know, over the last 20 years, there was a lot of disagreement about whether to ever go forward with an attack on Iran, especially an Israel-only attack on Iran. That's changed, right? There was virtual unanimity about going forward with this operation, and I think it reflects the fact that they believe that military deterrence has been reestablished. So even with setting back the program only a couple of years, you know, only in quotations, right? Depending on who's saying it, it has different connotation, but it's backed up by what I think the Israeli government believes is a credible threat that they can go back and do it again, and that they can successfully control the skies over Iran, that they can take out 40% of the missile launchers and, in fact, make it impossible for Iran to direct and execute a missile launch while Israeli Air Force are flying in the airspace above them, which is what happened during the 12 days. So I think there's a level of confidence there that was not there before the attack, and certainly not there before the US decision to engage in operations directly. How do they feel about a deal? I mean, I think a lot of what's happening right now in Washington with Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit is talking very much about where their alignment is on the path moving forward, where the red lines are, what will trigger potentially Israel deciding to go back and launch a second series of attacks on Iran. What they would see as acceptable in a deal, what they would see as not acceptable in a deal. I'm not sure that there's complete alignment there. I think that there's a very real possibility that that the Trump administration and certainly the president himself wants to get to a deal more aggressively than perhaps some in the Israeli establishment do. And so I think this is going to be an ongoing kind of consultation and coordination. But I will say that the level of coordination and consultation is as good as it has ever been. I would not say that it's unprecedented. I think that the especially at the establishment level, there has always been really remarkable, exquisite consultation and collaboration between Washington and Israel on security matters, but clearly we're in a different place now.
Right. So maybe moving to others, so our Arab partners in the region have historically had an interesting ambivalence towards Iran. I remember, during the Obama administration, certain ambassadors who will remain nameless saying, "You guys need to do something about the Iranians. We're on the front line here. You're going to get us killed." And then during the Trump administration taking a harder line and hearing, "You guys need to rein them in. You're going to get us killed." So, how we've seen both kind of outreach to Iran and condemnation of the Israeli strikes. And then we've seen things like the Jordanians actively participating in the air defense of Israel. So where where does Iran's nuclear program rank among the security priorities of Arab states, especially some of the Gulf monarchies like Saudi Arabia and the UAE?
So, I mean, this alone could be a whole hour conversation, right? Because it's so fascinating to see what's evolved over the last 6 months with Arab leadership, its willingness to do what it did last year to come to Israel's defense overtly as well as under the radar in ways that we had never seen before, and the U.S. bringing that coalition together. Israel accepting that coalition, which is a departure from their doctrine as well. Anyway, so I mean that alone is fascinating, but when it comes to the nuclear program, I mean, my assessment has always been, for especially dealing with our Gulf partners, that the threat of the nuclear program in Iran was really exponentially increased because it lended an umbrella to Iran's ability to conduct a undermining, a proxy terrorist-like activity in its neighborhood, right? So what these countries you are most concerned about was Iran's ability to undermine them on their own soil, right? To instigate and foment all kinds of instability, and to have a measure of protection that a nuclear program would provide, to conduct that with impunity. So the program itself, I think, can't be divorced from Iran's other policies towards its neighbors, because I think that's really what drove Arab leaders to be so vehemently focused on Iran's nuclear program and the need to do something about it. But I think you're exactly right that at the same time, what we've seen is a shift in their approach, and that a shift really started uh, right after the JCPOA, but was cemented during the first Trump administration, because what the Gulf leadership saw was that they did no longer had a reliable partner in Washington, at least not one that they could rely on the way they believed they needed to. So I'm caveating that quite a bit, but ultimately it led them to pursue a pretty serious de-escalation approach of their own, and to find ways to manage the Iran threat directly, without being so reliant on Washington to do it for them. And so, what I think we have now is a region that has publicly condemned the attacks, obviously, but privately, it's probably a mixture of relief and concern, right? Relief because the Iran threat has changed so dramatically over the last 8 months. Iran's proxy network, its ability to project power, and now its nuclear program. But concern because miscalculation is real, and if miscalculation happens, they are likely to be the front lines. I think that's why we saw such a highly orchestrated retaliation against the US base in Qatar by Iran, because all of these leaders want to control for that kind of conflagration of conflict with Iran. Um, so I think they want to see a deal. They want to see the ability to kind of cement some of this weakening of Iran in a way that allows them to do what they really want to do, which is pursue kind of economic development and the kind of stabilizing activities that they can't do when they're surrounded by this degree of instability.
Right. That's really, really helpful. We've got a couple questions in the Q&A. We've got one, I'm going to try to nuance it a bit. The question is, should the Trump administration have gone to Congress for authorization before the strikes against Iran? obviously they would say they didn't have to. Can you try to parse out why they didn't, or why they felt like they didn't have to under the War Powers Act? And then and what congressional action was there? I know there was a resolution in the Senate by Senator Kane. I think it was Ro Khanna and Thomas Massey in the House. So what was the dynamic that you were getting from that initiative?
So it's an excellent question. I think the answer is quite sober, I think, for me, because it reflects just a shift over decades away from congressional authorizations for the use of force as a general matter, and a concentration of power in the executive with respect to military force as a practical one. So it's hard to imagine that this administration would seek that authorization when we've seen the last 4 or 5 administrations, kind of, with the exception of the Iraq authorizations, really thwart that role of Congress authorizing preemptively the use of force. Um, so so I think, unfortunately, it's just a devolution of and an erosion of that congressional prerogative. This administration, I would imagine, I did not see the report that they are required to send to Congress within 48 hours, and they did send to Congress, as I understand it. But I would imagine that it justified the action because it was limited in scope, limited in duration. Um, it did not put U.S. forces um, into harm's way in perpetuity, or for an inexplicable period of time. And in fact, by the time the certification went up, the hostilities, quote unquote, were done, right? And so there's a debate here on whether or not you can talk about imminent threat, and whether there was an imminent threat from Iran's nuclear program. Certainly, the government of Israel has said that there was advancement in the program such that the threat had increased exponentially. I do not know what that intelligence is, but presumably it was shared with the Trump administration. And so it's possible they could make an argument of imminent threat, and therefore the need for self-defense. But I think all of that's kind of technical and interesting, but not really relevant, right? What's most relevant is that politically, that exercising of the congressional power to pre-authorize the use of force has eroded. What you've seen and what you saw in the votes that took place, in the chambers, or the resolutions that were proposed in the vote that took place in the Senate, is other elements of the War Powers Act being exercised, right? So those are demands by Congress that the administration basically come back to it if it plans on continuing to put U.S. service members in hostilities, right? So if it continues for more than a certain period of time, then congressional authorization is required. And if that authorization is not granted, then the executive branch would have to withdraw those forces from hostilities. So it's a different mechanism than kind of preemptively authorizing the use of force on the front end. Again, the example of the Iraq War being the one that sticks in most people's minds. But it's other aspects of the law that can be used to at least constrain the executive branch's ability to conduct open-ended hostilities. And of course, what we saw is that the votes are not there, not under the current makeup of the Senate. But if nothing else, and this is a personal view, it's not an analytical one. It's a good thing that the Senate chooses to continue to exercise those tools, because if it doesn't, then that tool erodes, much like the preemptive authorization of the use of force erodes over time. I don't know if you agree with that, Chris, but and I'd be curious what you think. But even when the votes aren't there, the fact that Congress does have this prerogative to exercise is one that we have to continue to find ways to use uh, to make sure that the executive branch understands that this tool is available for Congress under the right circumstances to exercise.
Yeah, no, I think you're right that that particular tool is a muscle that needs to be exercised. Um, and I think that, that like even if you don't have the votes, I think the effort is worthwhile. I mean, because we saw, I mean, with the exception of Senator Fetterman, the entire Democratic caucus, I believe, voted in favor of Senator Kane's resolution. So it splits down party lines, but there's always the chance to either pick someone off, or potentially it becomes an issue in the midterms. And all of a sudden maybe you get to a point where you do have the votes. Um,
I think
another,
also, I'm
yeah,
sorry,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
No, go ahead.
I think it also puts us in a position where, at least for almost any administration, uh, it kind of it forces them to articulate what it is that they're doing, right? Even if the votes aren't there. But it does put pressure on an administration to articulate what its plan is, what it intends to achieve, how it's going to kind of strategically leverage the kind of military intervention it just pursued to some greater end, right? Like it again, any other administration would probably feel some of that pressure. This administration, perhaps not as much as we would like, but even so, I do think that it does present like a rallying cry around why are we doing this and what is the United States getting itself into. And so even when the votes aren't there, setting that foundation, I think, is critically important. Sorry to keep going on that one,
Not
but
at all. So we have another question which dovetails with one that I had. So I'm gonna ask it. Um, in kind of broad strokes, what happens if there's no agreement? Is there a best case scenario? Is it an Iranian regime with less capacity and ability to wreak havoc? I've noticed myself that the U.S., Israel, and Iran seem to have burned through a lot of their stocks and munitions, missiles, and interceptors. We've seen reports that CENTCOM has been pulling munitions and interceptors away from Indo-PACOM, which potentially creates a problem for our China strategy. So, how much? What like like what are the potential scenarios if there is no deal, and how much capacity for another round of conflict do the US, Israel, and Iran have left?
yeah, it's an excellent question. I mean, I think look, the very real pessimistic slash cynical answer to that question is, without a deal, I would imagine the Iranian regime is seriously considering how it dashes for a nuclear bomb.
Mhm.
It is now convinced that a Israel and or the United States will continue to attack it, that it will probably continue a strategy of targeted assassination, and so to an earlier point I made, this regime is interested in one thing above all, and that's its own survival. And so it's going to look for ways to build the leverage to ensure that survival as much as it possibly can. Now, is that an immediate response to the current state of affairs? No, I don't think so. But I do think that we have to prepare for that possibility that covertly, or the regime is already thinking about how it might execute a plan to dash for a bomb. If there are no negotiations, if there's increased pressure, if there isn't kind of a viable path of diplomacy that is serious, and this that the Trump administration makes clear is a credible option, then I think the possibility for that dash only increases. I think that we've already seen that there are levers here for Iran to pull. I mean, we've seen the return of Houthi attacks on the Red Sea, 2 ships already in the last 2 days, several mariners killed, and others taken hostage. It brings kind of what 12% of global commerce to a screeching halt. So there are still ways for Iran to assert some pain here. Uh, Now, I think it will also, in the absence of a credible negotiation process, reconstitute elements of its program, um, and will find ways to do that, it, covertly and overtly. So what that will bring, however, is I think a cycle of retaliation by Israel, right? And so in the current dynamic, Iran rebuilds, Israel reattacks, right? And we kind of see this constant tit for tat that always turns up the pressure, turns up the temperature, and increases the potential for miscalculation, where perhaps those measured responses end up flaring into something a lot worse. A, you bring up the what can a lot worse look like, right? And what's the capacity to protect against those things? Uh, what we've seen over last April, last October, and 12 days in June is that Israel's defenses are pretty exquisite. It's a testament to what Israel, with very significant US support, has been able to accomplish, to really have this layered system of defenses. And I think to a certain extent, um, the decision to attack Iran in June came with the very real acceptance of some serious risk and potential high numbers of casualties inside of Israel. As it was only several dozen casualties, but which is, I think, a lot less than maybe they may have expected. But I think that reminds us that that number could be a lot higher. There is a finite capacity, both in terms of the kinds of interceptors that are needed in such a multi-layered defense system, and the kinds of assets the US has put into the region that it was using to help assist. So you're exactly right. Like if those assets require positioning in the Middle East, it means that they're not somewhere else. It means that the production of the interceptors that are necessary to be used in those systems are not focused on production of other things that might be necessary for other strategic uh, threats that the US is facing. And so this does definitely create a little bit of a game of chicken, right? Like who runs out of what first, and how do you keep up with that need to replenish and that is far below the kind of strategic of question, is a question of where are the other vulnerabilities that are taking on more risk at the expense of continued need to defend in the Middle East.
Yeah,
Sorry.
it's worrisome. I mean, the U.S. Army has 7 THAAD batteries on the planet, and 2 of them are in the Middle East, um, which is worrisome. I want to do. We're coming close to time, but I'd like to go to the Q&A one more time. So this is more a sanctions, and maybe I can scope it to a sanctions relief question. So the question is, Iran has faced severe sanctions several times, and the result was what we see. I think the idea that Iran has shown that it can, that it is willing to accept a certain level of sanctions with its resistance economy, and not just that, but find a way over, around, and through sanctions. So my take on the question, I think, is, what does Iran have to gain from sanctions relief, from the carrot of sanctions relief, especially since they've shown that that the regime at least can handle the stick? But with the caveat that you said that, that the regime's first, second, third, probably fourth and fifth concern is its own survival. How much more of the stick are they willing to take? And at what point and what kind of sanctions relief do you think is the biggest enticement for them?
So I think the biggest enticement for them, despite what, and I'm going to plagiarize a fellow expert and colleague who I deeply respect here a little bit. This misconception that Iran seeks trade with the United States, and what it really wants is a removal of the trade embargo between the United States and Iran. This regime doesn't want that, because its entire raison d'etre is anti-US, it's anti-American, it's anti-Western, and so it will not invite kind of an opening up of its own economy to what it would see as the perversion of US trade, right? And what that would do to its population, more importantly. So that's not the enticement. The enticement is Iran's ability to open up trade with the rest of the world, and they're really looking at their immediate neighborhood, looking east, some resumption with Europe, although I think this regime has soured on its relationships with many European capitals in recent years. But nonetheless, I think because ultimately they want to be seen as a legitimate and credible player on the international stage. And in order to do that, they need to have an economy that can engage at that level. And so the enticement is that it's that combination of legitimacy and economic potential, and realizing that economic potential that would come from the relief of sanctions that prohibit that kind of economic involvement of European, Asian, and other countries with Iran today. What we haven't seen is much of a depletion of Iran's black market. We haven't seen much depletion of the economic healthiness of the wealthiest in the Iranian system, particularly those who have relationships in the Revolutionary Guard or with the regime in other ways. So does opening up help enrich those who are already rich in Iran, or does it make the disparities between them and the rest of society even more stark? I'm not an economist, so I can't answer that question, but I think it's a question that needs to be asked. So the enticement is really about lifting that kind of pariah status and allowing Iran to engage with others on the international stage with whom it wants to engage. It really isn't about rapprochement with the United States. That
Right.
that kind of answers the question, but
Yeah, it's helpful. And there's maybe, Elisa, if you, I know we're pretty much at time, but if you have time for one more, there's a good one in the queue. Can the U.S. simultaneously deter Iranian aggression and preserve diplomatic channels with Iran, or are these goals mutually exclusive? I think the short answer to that is yes, they can. But then the follow-up is, what diplomatic, cultural, or humanitarian tools could the U.S. leverage to play a peace building role rather than just military or strategic actor to de-escalate tensions?
Ah, a question that warms my heart. And one that I probably can't answer quickly, but look, there's a school of thought here that reestablishing deterrence is necessary to get Iran to engage in the kinds of concessions that are required for a diplomatic process. I think we're going to have to wait and see, frankly, right? We have not seen this degree of military action against Iran before. And so the reverberations of that, how it will change the regime's calculus, what the regime will be willing to do, I think we are going to have to see some of that play itself out. But I think I land in the same place, Chris, that I think you can do both. I think what it requires is something I alluded to earlier, which is you really do have to make the diplomatic piece credible. You have to be able to articulate quite seriously and quite tangibly uh, what it is that Iran has to gain from diplomacy, what that sanctions relief looks like, what the other diplomatic and political elements might look like, how it is to gain from making what it likely sees as pretty difficult concessions to swallow. I mean, the previous supreme leader, the first supreme leader, talks about having taken a drink from the poison chalice when he made the decision to end the Iraq-Iran war. We're talking about that degree of political decision for a regime that is already weak, and so it's going to need to see that credible path. And I think the challenge for this administration is how to articulate that kind of complicated and difficult diplomacy, how to sustain that kind of complicated and difficult diplomacy, and make it a credible tool as opposed to simply resorting to kind of rhetoric and the threat of military action. So you can do both if both are given kind of equal bearing. And I think we have to wait and see if diplomacy gets its shot here.
Right. And uh, I know we are at time, so on that hopeful note, I will end it. Elisa, thank you so much. This has been really helpful. I think it's been really informative for our members, and personally, it's been great to get the band back together and talk Middle East. So thank you so much for taking time out of what I know is a busy time for you and Johnny to talk us through some of these issues.
It's been such a treat. I hope it was informative. I hope that it helped kind of broaden the picture that you've already started painting for your members. I'm happy to do it anytime that there's an interesting thing developing that requires a cynical Washington view, and maybe even come to Maine and do it so in person. So thank you so much for the opportunity, and my nostalgia is off the charts, Chris. So I'm just so pleased that we got to do this.
And
Outstanding.
I just want to thank both of you. This has been extremely informative. It has not been good for my battle with cynicism either. And has reinforced some of my, deepest concerns. But also, I was really appreciative of the last question, to allow us to sort of end on a little bit of hope here. Um, Thank you. And again, members, thank you for being here this evening, for your interest. As I mentioned at the beginning, we're trying to line up some additional webinars on this topic, perhaps some in-person talks as well. So if there are particular aspects of this relationship that you are interested in, please feel free to shoot me an email. We're going to have a program committee meeting this week and talk about this. I also wanted to to extend an invitation I received from the Fig Tree Alliance, which is a local group looking at coexistence between Israelis and Palestinians. They've invited 5 young Israelis and Palestinians who are on a U.S. speaking tour to be at USM this Friday from 6 to 8:30. So if you are interested in attending that, again, please send me a quick email. The last thing I need to say as part of my job is that the board has decided to extend our 2025 annual appeal until July 15th to see if we can raise the additional funds that we need to close our budget shortfall. I know many of you who came here tonight have given and given generously, and we are profoundly grateful for that. But for those of you who have not, or can perhaps give more, we would really appreciate the generosity at this particular time. So with no further ado, Chris and Elisa, thank you. Certainly, we have room for you here in Maine now and would love to see you again. And we look forward to another great conversation on these important topics. Everyone, good night and see you all soon.